Hello, my name is Jordan.
Hi, I'm Theo, and I'm depressed.
And welcome to Depressed and Political, Episode 1, aka our one and only episode.
Today we'll be talking about a very divisive topic, politics, specifically the politics and the emergence of major political parties leading up to the beginning of the Civil War.
But before we get straight to talking about the main conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans,
The main event, if you will.
we have to start at the beginning of the formation of the American party system, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, aka the Democratic Republicans.
So when the Americans created the Declaration of Independence, slavery was already a sensitive issue, so Jefferson said, let's put a pin in this, keep this in mind for later.
Foreshadowing!
So then we had the end of the revolution, and people were like, okay, cool, we're running out of money, we need some stuff. And we also need to, form a government. So they were like, here, we're going to create the Constitution, and decided to leave the pin in slavery. Washington already disliked political parties, but he couldn't really do anything about it. He was basically peer pressured into being the president. And then, of course, during this time, there was animosity between Hamilton and Jefferson because of their opposing views on the government.
Thomas Jefferson stated on February 12, 1798, in writing a letter to John Wise,
Two political sects have arisen within the U.S., the one believing that the executive is the branch of our government which the most needs support, the other that, like the analogous branch in the English government, it is already too strong for the Republican parts of the Constitution, and therefore, in equivocal cases, they incline to the legislative powers. The former of these are called Federalists, sometimes aristocrats or monocrats, and sometimes Tories. After the corresponding sect in the English government of exactly the same definition, the latter are stilted Republicans, Whigs, Jacobins, anarchists, disorganizers, etc. These terms are in familiar use with most persons.
So, to clarify, the Federalists were Alexander Hamilton's political party, while the Democratic Republicans were Jefferson's. And really the main differences were that the Federalists support the wealthy people and the aristocrats of the Americas, and the Democratic Republicans don't. They are more for the commoners and middle-class Americans. Another additional difference is that the Federalists support what the Constitution doesn't forbid. So it's very interpretive. It's up to debate. While the Democratic Republicans believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, meaning what it says is what you have to do. The Federalists are pro-British, the Democratic Republicans are pro-French when they were discussing the animosity between these two countries. And the Federalists also believed in a national banking system, while the Democratic Republicans were not. And then obviously a big difference was kind of also seen later in the Civil War and before then was between the North and the South, and merchants and trade versus agriculture. And then by 1814, unfortunately, the Federalists had fallen apart and they never again won an election, while the Democratic Republicans continued winning elections.
Yeah, like Jordan said, the Federalists, they fell apart, and so the Democratic Republicans just continued to win constantly, and by the time after 1812 was over, we had the era of good feelings, and life was good at this point, and there was only one political party that mattered.
And this leads us into the election of 1824, an extremely important election in American history, and it was between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams.
John Quincy Adams won the election and made Henry Clay the Secretary of State. This was called the corrupt bargain. This made Jackson and his supporters extremely upset, and they formed the Democrats between 1824 and 1828. Jackson was finally elected in 1832, and Jackson's opponents formed the Whig Party.
So, to sum this up, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans were the first political parties until eventually the Federalists died out, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the only political party. Eventually, in the 1820s and 1830s, the Democratic Republicans split into two separate parties due to opposing views surrounding the election of 1824. These two parties were the Whigs and the Democrats.
Andrew Jackson led the Democrats, and basically they glorified the liberty of the individual, and they were much more skeptical of the government. They were huge on the Manifest Destiny. They wanted to expand westward as much as they could, and they really did support the rights of the states as individual states. They supported little federal interference in social and economic affairs of the people, because they weren't super big on the government being super involved with the people. Jackson's critics were the Whigs, and they valued community and harmony in society over this individuality type thing that the Democrats had going on. They were willing to use the government in order to reach their goals, so they kind of used it more as a stepping stone, which is a bit more like puppet mastery than the Democrats were. And they favored the national bank, protective tariffs, internal improvements. They wanted public schools, and they were super for the reforms like prohibition and abolition.
So, in 1854, the Whigs died out due to the deaths of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, as well as a split in the party, meaning pro-slavery versus anti-slavery, because of the Compromise of 1850. And after this, the Republicans rose up to take the party's place. The Democrats were still around, though, and the animosity between the two was great.
The main difference between these two parties was that the Republicans were anti-slavery and the Democrats were pro-slavery, and this of course led to rising tensions, such as Dred Scott versus Stanford, the Panic of 1857, the Tariff of 1857, and the Sumner-Brooks-Cane thing, which is where dude got beat up with a cane. Here's our source.
I then went to the Senate and waited until it adjourned. There were some ladies in the hall, and I had to wait a full hour until they left. I then went to SSC and said, Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech with care, and as much impartiality as was possible, and I feel it my duty to tell you that you have libelled my state and slandered a relative who is aged and absent, and I come to punish you for it. At the concluding words, I struck him with my cane and gave him about 30 first-rate stripes with a gutta percha cane, which had been given me a few months before by a friend from North Carolina named Vic. Every lick went where I intended. For about the first 5 of 6 licks, he offered to make fight, but I plied him so rapidly that he did not touch me. Towards the last, he bellowed like a calf. I wore my cane out completely, but saved the head, which is gold. The fragments of the stick are begged for sacred relics. Every Southern man is delighted, and the abolitionists are like a hive of disturbed bees. I expected to be attacked this morning, but no one came near me. They are making all sorts of threats. It would not take much to have the throats of every abolitionist cut. I have been arrested, of course, and there is now a resolution before the House, the object of which is to result in my expulsion. This they can't do, it requiring 2/3 to do it, and they can't get a half. Every Southerner man sustains me.
So, this led to an eventual split between the North and the South, meaning there's a political party in the North and the other in the South, and they are against each other. Up until this point, there had never really been this division. The North and the South had their disagreements, and political parties tended to fall on opposite sides of the country, but it had never been this definitive. It had never been a split, one party on one side and one party on the other. There was always mixing. And now there really isn't. This leads us to
The Civil War!
the Civil War!